Hi viewers, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be explaining the CRF Annotation Guidelines. If you are working in clinical data management, clinical programming or regulatory submissions, understanding how to annotate a case report form or CRF is essential. In this video, we will talk you through what CRF annotation is, why it's important and how to do it according to industry standards. Anyone who have worked on any clinical study, SDTM programming, will have seen either a blank CRF or a annotated CRF or even both. So one might ask, what is a blank CRF and how and when is it designed for a study? A blank CRF is designed after the protocol is finalized but before the study starts. C- standards help to decide what kind of questions go in the CRF and how they should be asked. So the blank CRF acts as a blueprint to guide what data to collect during the study. It provides the standard questions, formats, and naming conventions to make sure data collected from different studies is consistent and can be easily understood and analyzed later. So in simple layman language, you can say a blank CRF or a case report form is a form that contains questions or fields to be filled based on the medical assessment done during a particular visit to the clinic or hospital, often called as a site visit. It basically it's basically like a questionnaire or checklist that the study team uses to record important health information about the patient during each visit in a clinical trial. So the next question one might ask is, what is an annotated CRF or ACRF? CRF annotation is the process of marking each data entry on the case report form with its corresponding SDTM variable name. This annotated CRF becomes a critical part of the define.xml file in regulatory submissions and provide traceability from the raw CRF data to the SDTM datasets. You will typically see annotations as small sticky notes or text boxes near to the form fields indicating the SDTM variable name that maps to that field. Please note that the annotated CRF should be in the PDF format with the file name of acrf.pdf. This file name was suggested by the FDA and the PMDA. Now let's talk about why the CRF annotation is important. CRF annotation plays a crucial role in regulatory compliance. There are parts of the required submission packages to authorities like FDA and PMDA. Annotations provide transparency and traceabilities. Reviewers can clearly see where each SDTM variable originated. For example, the AE start date field annotated with AE STDTC allows reviewers to confirm where each date in the AE domain came from. It also helps clinical programmers during dataset creation and review, thus reducing the ambiguity about from where the data came. The next is the tools used for annotation. CRF annotations are usually applied to a PDF version of the CRF using tools like the Adobe Acrobat Pro. Annotations are made using comment tools such as sticky notes or text boxes where you enter the SDTM variable name. Other tools like the PDF Exchange editor or Foxit PDF editor or even an automated annotation system integrated with EDCs can also be used. But the industry standards remain the Adobe Acrobat. In automated setups, the annotation might be pre-configured based on the EDC form metadata, thus reducing the manual work. An important tip here is that whenever you do an annotation on the for the CRF, always log the annotations once finalized to prevent any accidental changes. When it comes to submitting clinical trial data to regulatory agencies like the FDA, CRF annotation isn't just a best practice, it's a requirement. The FDA's Standard Data Tabulation Model Metadata Submission Guidelines for Human Clinical Trials, or simply the SDTM MSG, provide the official guidance on how metadata, including the annotated CRF, should be prepared and submitted. This document outlines what the annotated CRF must contain, how it should be formatted, and how it aligns with the define.xml metadata. In other words, the SDTM MSG ensures that your CRF annotations are not only clear and consistent, but also regulatory compliant. So if you are creating or reviewing the CRF, the SDTM MSG is the key reference to it. Let's go through the guidelines given by the SDTM MSG on how to do the CRF annotation. The first one is that each domain represented on CRF page or collected screen should have its own annotation. The next guideline is that the domain annotation should use black text with bold formatting. The variable annotation should use the black text without bold formatting. Annotation should utilize a 12-point font size, which is again it uses the Arial font, but the size is of 12 point, except where a sponsor choose to increase or decrease the annotation font size to accommodate their CRF pages or the collection screens. In this example, you can see the annotation for domain, that is the EC exposure as collected. In this, it is the font is in bold, whereas the annotation done for the variables are not in the bold formatting. The next guideline is that the annotation for variables and dataset codes should be capitalized. That is, like for example, the variable birth DTC or the AEAC, and in these are these should be mentioned in capitalized format. For dataset labels, the convention is that it should be the two domain letter, and in brackets it should be in the label of the domain, and the whole thing should be in parentheses. Here the example is in parentheses DM, and after the space of in brackets there is the demographics. The next is that the instructional text or command should be in sentence case, excluding the variables and dataset codes, which should be capitalized as discussed. Notes, which are annotations explaining a situation on the CRF and not direct variables annotation, should have the color of the domain to which they pertain. Notes that pertain to multiple domains should have an appropriate background that signifies that they are not domain specific. Sponsor can give such notes a dashed border to differentiate them from collected variable annotation. Here I am showing you one example where you can see that in this CRF form there are two domains annotated. One is the disposition, the other is the demographics. Please note that the domain annotation is following the same convention as discussed, that it is the two letter domain along with the domain label in parenthesis, and the variables annotation, wherever it is done, it is in the capital case. Another thing to note here is that the instructional notes or the text here, which we normally sometimes specify in any CRF form, that are being present in the dashed box here, and you can see that since this note, which is shown in this example, is related to race variable of DM, the color coding of the text box is same as the color coding of our DM dataset variables. The next is that when annotating multiple domains on a single CRF page or collecting or the collection screen, that CDISC as MSG team recommends using the following sequence of code colors. That is, first domain that is annotated on any CRF form should be in the color code of blue. The second domain should be yellow, third green, and fourth orange. Sponsors who need more than 4 colors on their CRF page should use consistent colors and take color blindness into consideration. As we have seen in the previous shown example where DS as well as demographics both were annotated, you might have noticed that the DS domain was annotated in blue color and the second domain, which was the DM domain, that was annotated in yellow color. So for in case we are annotating multiple domains on any single CRF form, we should follow the color coding in this format. That is, the first domain annotated should be in the blue color, the second yellow, third green, and fourth orange, and so on. The next is that the supplemental references via boxes, arrows, and lines can be used to further clarify annotations. This method should be limited or avoided when not necessary. Here you can see in this example for the questionnaire form for the SWLS category here that the arrow box is a blue arrow and a blue box is used to annotate the QSORRES as whereas the red line arrow and the red rectangle box is used to annotate the stress C and stress N variable of QS. When multiple variables are annotated within the same annotation, it is recommended to use the forward slash to separate the variables. Here you can see the annotation for QS stress C and QS stress N being done in the same text box and it is being separated by a forward slash. The next is annotation for collected data which will not be in the SDTM data. For example, there are some prompt questions. They should be annotated as not submitted. You can see here in this OE domain that the question for this split lamp examination performed yes or no is annotated as not submitted because this is a prompt question here in this form. If the uh, investigator mentioned that this exam was not performed and select no, then this form will not be enabled and he will not be able to fill any further details in this form, and whereas if he selects yes, then the rest of the form will be enabled and he can fill the visit date and other information captured in this form. So in the data, only when the response is yes, you will get the information which is entered by the investigator. So in this case, this is a prompt question and it will not be used in the SDTM data. So that's why this is marked as not submitted. Same is the case with the I domain here, where the I form will be enabled only when the met criteria question is being answered as yes here, yes or no. When constructing a when then annotation statement, the MSG team recommends the format of when equal to. What does that mean? Let's see in this example that where the interpretation of normal abnormal is being annotated to the OEORS when OE test CD is equals to interpretation. So what does that mean is that the interpretation of normal or abnormal response will be captured in OEORRES, but what will be the test code for that. So to know that this result will be mapped with along with the INTP test code, we use the convention of when equal to. So here the annotation will be OEORRES when OE test CD equals to INTP. Sometimes I have seen there the cases where the annotation is being done that only OE ORRES is being mentioned and the test code is not mentioned. So in that case, that annotation will not be correct because you cannot identify that this information which is mapped to ORRES variable, the result collected result variable is the result of which test. So that's why in that scenario, the correct annotation is to use the when equals to or the when test code equals to and the test code value here as shown. Now the next thing is the changes in SDTM MSG version 2.0 from to 1.0. So far, whatever guideline which we are talking on are the guidelines mentioned in the SDTM MSG version 2.0. But before 2.0, there was a version 1.0 also. So there were few changes made from 1.0 to 2.0, and now let's see what are those changes. So please note, if you are following the SDTM MSG version 2.0, you have to be compliant with the 2.0 version and make sure the changes which are done from 1.0 are not being used in your CRF annotation. In SDTM MSG version 1.0, the variable annotation example featured red, bold, and italics text, although no preferences were included in the document. In SDTM MSG version 2.0, this was re-examined and determined that annotations were easier to read and covered less of the CRF page when the black text without bold or italics was used. Similarly, the SDTM MSG version 1.0 also included domain annotations that use the equality format. Here you can see the DS equals to disposition was the way which we normally used when we were using the SDTM MSG version 1.0. This made the domain and variable annotation look very similar without any clear visual distinction. Because of that, this was updated in MSG version 2.0 to better help distinguish between the domains and variable annotation. This was further accomplished by ensuring domain annotation remain in black text with bold formatting but without italicization. So here you can see that there are two changes being shown from version 1.0 to 2.0. The first is text uh, the text coloring. Earlier it was the red color with the bold format, but now it is black format with no bold or italics. Where the second is that when you are annotating for any domain, the equality sign is being removed. Let's talk about the case when we have to annotate the finding domains. Because of the vertical nature of the SDTM finding domains, it may be necessary to provide the test code in the annotation. For example, annotating a field as simply VSORRES or VSORRESU might not always be sufficient, and it may be necessary to also indicate the test CD to ensure explicit context. The following example shows two annotation methods for the same vital sign CRF path. In example 1, the CRF annotation is using the ORRES when test code equals to format in a single annotation. In this example, the CRF page has a lot of free space to apply this method of annotation. However, certain CRF pages might not allow for this method of white space, in which case another annotation method may be necessary. In example 2, even though the CRF page is identical, it uses separate annotation for VS Test CD and VS ORRES. Both of the examples are considered acceptable. Next is annotating the supplemental qualifier. When annotating supplemental qualifiers, annotate the QNAM variables and the supplemental qualifier domain. For example, here you can see in this two forms that we are giving the QNAM in sub and then the domain name format. The rationale for this approach is that potential review tools can join the supplemental qualifier values with the correct data rows from the parent domain. This will allow the reviewer to know what the variable name is and that it originated in the supplemental qualifier. Next is annotating the rel-rec. When a form indicates a relationship between collected data, the annotation should indicate the collection as well as the rel-rec relationship. In the example shown, the adverse events are collected on the adverse event CRF form, whereas the AID number is collected as the A link ID. If a subject, disposition, death, or finding about records is related to an AE, then the AID is also collected on those pages, thereby establishing a relationship between these records and the AE. The rel-rec should be annotated using the convention rel-rec when equals to indicate that relationship. There may be times when adding the domain prefix before the variable might be necessary if the variable name does not indicate the domain. In this example, you can see that the DS form is having a log line, you can say, for the adverse event where we can identify that for which DS term we have a relationship with adverse event, and we can see that the DS term and the DS link ID is being mentioned on the DS form, and it is related through rel-rec with the A link ID in the form of annotation as the rel-rec when DS link ID equals to A link ID. So when you will see the DS data or the A data, you can come to know that when you have the A link ID and the DS link ID as same you will have for that DS term, you can relate these two records with the AE and DS. The same is the case for the death dataset, that if the adverse event results in the death, then the A link ID which was used for death for that adverse event which resulted in death will be mentioned in the death CRF form as well, and you can map that to the DD link ID variable, and using the DD link ID variable and the A link ID variable you can create the rel-rec. Here's a question that often gets overlooked but can really impress in an SDTM or clinical data standards interview. According to the SDTM Metadata Submission Guidelines, when should an annotation box on the CRF have a dotted outline? The correct answer to this question is that according to the FDA SDTM Metadata Submission Guidelines or the SDTM MSG, a dotted annotation box is used in one specific case. That is, when the field is not directly collected on the CRF but is used in a calculation or derivation from the derivation that contributes to an SDTM variable. If you remember in for the questionnaire form which I have shown you earlier, where the questionnaire form was capturing two information. One was the QS ORRES, the other as the QS stress C and stress N. The QS ORRES was having a bold outline, whereas the QS stress C stress N separated by a slash, the forward slash, was in the dotted line text box. Why that was the case? Because the information that was captured on CRF was the result value, that was the originally captured result, which goes in the QS/ORRES variable. However, using this information which is captured, we derive the standard value of in character and numeric format, which is why, since this value was derived from the ORRES, but this information which is captured is also the information which will be used to derive the stress C and stress N variable in QS. We have used the dotted line text box in the annotation. Another example for this is the case when the subject age is not collected directly on the CRF but is derived from their birth date and informed consent date. You do not annotate the field age, but if you do annotate it, it should be in the dotted box, indicating that it is derived, not directly collected. Using a dotted annotation box signals to the reviewer that this variable wasn't entered by the site, but was created based on other collected data. It's a small detail, but it shows that you understand both submission standards and regulatory expectations, and that can set you apart as a candidate in the interview. That's a wrap up on CRF Annotation Guidelines. Whether you are a clinical programmer or a data manager, mastering CRF annotation is a critical skill. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more clinical data insights. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Let me know in comments if you want me to cover any specific topic.